The icy wind slashed across the alley as Eiko's voice, sharp with rage and desperation, cut through the blizzard. He left us here to freeze like we were nothing. Her small fists pounded against the locked iron gate, snowflakes melting on her flushed cheeks. Behind her, Hannah stumbled, clutching a tattered sketchbook to her chest, refusing to let it go even as her lips turned blue. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, tall, composed, impossibly out of place in this chaos. But when he reached for them, the truth hit like a jolt. This was no rescue they'd been promised. Or was it? If your heart's already pounding, drop a like and tell me what would you do next. The wind howled through the streets of Edinburgh, carrying with it shards of icy rain that seemed to cut through the very bones. Miles Davenport, a man whose name was whispered in the corridors of power and printed across the financial pages of every major newspaper, tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his sleek black Jaguar. Even for someone accustomed to controlling billion-dollar mergers with a calm hand, this weather was testing him. The city hadn't seen a storm this fierce in over a decade. His headlights barely pierced the wall of sleet as he wound his way through the outskirts toward his estate on the edge of Arthur's Seat, a location he had chosen for its breathtaking solitude. Miles had always been a solitary figure. Despite his enormous wealth and influence, or perhaps because of it, he had learned to live apart from the world. His mansion stood on a rise above the city, its stone walls weathered by centuries but fortified with modern luxury. He had invested millions in restoring it, not for entertaining guests. He rarely had any, but for the quiet. Privacy was his currency, and he spent it lavishly. However, on that night his journey home would be interrupted in a way he could never have anticipated. As he approached the tall wrought iron gates that marked the boundary of his property, the beams of his headlights caught something strange. Two small shapes huddled near the stone gate post, barely distinguishable through the swirling snow. At first he thought they were stray animals, some poor creatures driven to his gates by the cold. But as the distance closed, the truth became chillingly clear: they were children. Miles slammed on the brakes, the Jaguar skidding slightly before stopping. He stepped out, and the icy wind hit him with such force it stole his breath. His expensive wool coat was no match for this biting cold, but he didn't hesitate. The shapes resolved into two girls no more than 7 years old, dressed in threadbare coats with snow crusted along the hems. Their faces were pale lips tinged blue, their small bodies trembling violently. "What on earth are you doing out here?" Miles asked, his voice sharper than intended, a reflex born of shock. The girls didn't answer. One clutched the other's hand tightly as if any separation would be unbearable. Their eyes, large, frightened, and eerily identical, fixed on him with a mixture of wariness and desperation. Without waiting for a reply, Miles shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around both of them, the warmth seeming almost too little too late. He scooped them up in his arms, feeling their frail weight, and carried them through the storm toward the mansion. The door opened before he could even call out. Mrs. Whitaker, his long-serving housekeeper, had heard the car pull up. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight. "Good heavens, sir. Where did they—" "At the gate," Miles interrupted, stepping inside and kicking the door shut against the wind. The warmth of the grand foyer enveloped them, but the girls' shivers did not subside immediately. Mrs. Whitaker moved quickly, fetching blankets and a kettle for tea. Miles carried the children into the drawing room, where the fire blazed in the marble hearth, and set them gently on the deep leather sofa. As the heat began to reach them, he saw them more clearly. They were twins, identical down to the way their hair curled damply at the edges. Yet, even in their identical features, subtle differences emerged. One's gaze was direct and almost defiant, while the other's eyes darted around, absorbing every detail, yet speaking volumes in their silence. "Don't be afraid," Miles said quietly, surprising himself with the softness in his tone. you're safe now." However, safety was a relative concept, and as Mrs. Whitaker wrapped the girls in thick blankets and set steaming mugs of cocoa in their hands, Miles's mind raced. Children did not simply appear at the gates of a reclusive millionaire's estate in the middle of a storm. Someone had brought them here, and for reasons he could not yet guess. Outside, the storm raged on wind, shrieking through the chimneys like some ancient ghost. Inside, a strange new presence filled the rooms, one that neither Miles nor his carefully constructed life had been prepared for. He sat in the high-backed chair opposite the sofa, studying the girls as they slowly sipped their cocoa. He thought of his own childhood, of the long, cold winters after his parents died, when his only refuge had been in the unyielding silence of boarding schools. Finally, one of the twins spoke, her voice steady but small. "We were told you could help us." Miles leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Who told you that?" The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking to her sister before she answered. "Our stepfather. He said you were rich and kind, and that you might give us a home." It was such a peculiar combination of flattery and abandonment that Miles almost laughed, but the weight of the situation pressed the reaction back down. "And where is he now?" The girl shrugged slightly, the gesture too mature for her age. "Gone. He left us at your gate and drove away." Miles sat back, the firelight flickering across his face. It was one thing to make a large donation to a charity or fund an entire wing of a hospital. It was another to be handed the living, breathing embodiment of someone else's failure. Yet, as he looked at the two fragile forms wrapped in his coat and Mrs. Whitaker's blankets, a thought settled in his mind, quietly but firmly. No matter what else had been true about his life up to this point, tonight had changed everything. And while he could not yet see where this road would lead, he knew instinctively that turning these girls away was not an option. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, but inside the walls of Miles Davenport's fortress of solitude had already begun to crack. The fire had burned low, casting the drawing room in a softer amber light. Miles Davenport sat in silence, letting the girls drink their cocoa, their small hands wrapped around the mugs, as though they feared the warmth might vanish if they let go. They had not spoken much since their startling confession about the stepfather, and Miles, in his way, knew better than to push too hard too quickly. Trust was not something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, like the slow warming of the body after hours in the cold. He studied them, the quiet one, Hannah, now leaning her head against the arm of the sofa, her eyes heavy but alert, and the other Aiko sitting upright as if determined not to surrender to sleep in a stranger's home. The names had come reluctantly, after much coaxing from Mrs. Whitaker. There was something about the way they spoke them, too, almost as if saying them aloud was a way of holding on to themselves when the world seemed intent on taking everything else away. Miles's mind wandered back unbidden to his own youth. After his parents' sudden death, he had been shipped off to a boarding school in Surrey, where the days were as gray as the stone walls and the nights colder than the winter air. Adults had made decisions for him without explanation, and though his needs were met, there had been no warmth in the provision. It had taught him early that security without kindness was like a room without light, functional but suffocating. Perhaps that was why the sight of these two shivering children stirred something deeper than mere pity. However, pity alone would not solve the immediate problem. There were legalities to consider, procedures that would demand explanations neither he nor the twins were ready to give. Children abandoned at the gates of a reclusive millionaire's estate. It was the sort of story tabloids would devour, twisting fact into spectacle. Miles had spent years avoiding unnecessary attention. Now, these girls threatened to drag his carefully managed privacy into the public glare. Still, his questions multiplied. Who was this stepfather? Why had he chosen Miles of all people? The man's claim that Miles was rich and kind was almost laughable. His reputation in the business world leaned heavily on the rich part, far less on the kind. It was true that he had given millions to charities, but always at a distance, always through formal channels. Yet here were two living, breathing recipients of an entirely different kind of plea, one that required not money, but involvement. Aiko finally broke the silence, her voice low but clear. "Our mother is in the hospital." She didn't elaborate, but her gaze didn't waver from his. Miles felt the subtle challenge in her eyes, as though she were testing whether he would care enough to ask the next question. "What happened?" he asked, leaning forward. She had an accident. A car hit her while she was walking home from work. She hasn't woken up since." And your father, Hannah's voice barely more than a whisper, slipped into the space between them. "He died when we were 3. Miles sat back processing this. Orphans, in all but name, shuffled between an unconscious mother and a stepfather who had now abandoned them. In some ways it was worse than outright orphanhood. At least then the absence was final, not a lingering uncertainty. Mrs. Whitaker returned with more blankets, fussing over the girls in a way that made Miles realize just how long it had been since children had been inside these walls. The old house with its high ceilings and echoing halls seemed almost to soften in their presence, as though it too recognized the shift. Outside the windows the storm still battered the city, but inside a different kind of turbulence was forming. Miles knew the easy route call the authorities hand over the twins and retreat into the comfortable isolation he had built for himself. But another part of him, the part he had long buried beneath deals, acquisitions and layers of detachment, was unsettled by the thought of sending them away. Moreover, there was something about the way Aiko had spoken of her mother that lingered with him. Not the words themselves, but the conviction in her tone. It was as if she believed against all reason that their mother would wake, and that someone like Miles might be a part of making that happen. He could not understand why, but he found himself wanting to know more. "You said your stepfather brought you here. Why me?" Aiko's lips pressed into a thin line before she answered. "Because of this." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small weathered sketchbook. The cover was scuffed, the edges frayed, but when she opened it, Miles felt something stir in his chest. The first page held a drawing so precise and vivid, it was almost photographic, a seaside view of Monterey Bay, California. The kind of scene one could only capture from memory, not imagination. He blinked. This is where I grew up." Hannah nodded. "Our mother drew it. She said it was a place someone important to her once called home. It was a simple statement, but it landed heavily. The world was wide, yet here was a direct thread from these children's mother to his own past. Coincidence, perhaps, but the kind that demanded attention. He found himself wondering if their mother had known his parents, or perhaps crossed paths with him as a child, without either of them realizing it. Finally, Miles exhaled slowly. "Where is she now? Which hospital?" When Aiko told him, he recognized the name. It was one of the city's older institutions, respectable, but underfunded, a place where patients often languished longer than necessary due to lack of resources. He had funded projects there in the past, but always through intermediaries. Now the connection felt uncomfortably direct. The storm outside seemed to intensify, rattling the windows as if urging him toward a decision. Miles knew there would be consequences to whatever choice he made next. However, something had already shifted within him. The gate, the storm, the twins. They were no longer random interruptions to his evening. They were the beginning of something he could neither predict nor ignore. The storm had passed by, mourning, leaving Edinburgh cloaked in a fragile stillness. The snow clung to the trees and rooftops, turning the city into a postcard image, but inside Miles Davenport's estate, The atmosphere was anything but still. The twins had woken early, and Mrs. Whitaker, with a fondness that surprised even herself, had allowed them into the kitchen. By the time Miles entered, lured by the smell of warm bread, he found Aiko standing on a chair, carefully stirring a bowl of batter, while Hana sat at the table, sketching with a focus that made the rest of the room disappear. He paused in the doorway, watching. It was an unfamiliar scene for him, children moving through his space as though they belonged there. However, instead of the discomfort he had expected, there was a strange ease in it. The estate had always been immaculate, almost sterile, but now there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the central heating. Over the following days, a tentative rhythm began to form. Aiko, the more outgoing of the two, took to shadowing Mrs. Whitaker, eager to learn how to cook proper meals. She asked questions incessantly about recipes, about Edinburgh, about why the big clock in the hallway chimed at odd hours. Hana, on the other hand, preferred the quiet corners of the house. She carried her sketchbook everywhere, and Miles often found her sitting by the tall library windows, drawing whatever caught her eye. It was during one of these moments that he discovered the true extent of her talent. He had been passing by when he noticed the page she was working on, a detailed rendering of his study. Every item was captured perfectly, from the grain in the mahogany desk to the faint crease in the leather of his chair. But there was something else, too, in the drawing. A shaft of sunlight streamed in through the window, illuminating a vase of fresh flowers that did not exist in reality. "You've added something," he remarked gently, stepping closer. Hana looked up, unafraid. "It's how it should be," she said simply. It was then he began to understand. She wasn't just copying what she saw, she was recreating it, as she felt it ought to be, infusing each scene with a touch of hope or beauty, as if her drawings could repair the imperfections of the world. However, their time together was not without tension. One afternoon, Miles had to step out for a meeting in the city. He returned to find Aiko in tears in the foyer, Mrs. Whitaker trying to console her. Hana had slipped out through the side gate without telling anyone, and the winter light was already fading. They found her in the park nearby, sitting on a bench sketching a frozen pond. When Miles asked why she had gone, she only shrugged. "I needed to see something else," she said, as though the explanation was self-evident. Incidents like that reminded him that their trust in him was still fragile, and that their lives before his home had been unpredictable enough to make running away seem like a reasonable act. Building bonds would require patience, and he was learning that the hard way. Outside the safety of the estate, other forces were beginning to stir. Miles began receiving calls from acquaintances, some curious others prying about the children seen entering his property during the storm. The stepfather had not reappeared, but questions were being asked, and not all of them in good faith. Edinburgh was a city of old money and older gossip, and the sudden arrival of two vulnerable children in the care of one of its most reclusive figures was bound to draw attention. In the midst of this, Mrs. Whitaker suggested a visit to the hospital. "If you're serious about helping them," she said, "you should meet their mother. It will tell you more than any story could." The trip was sobering. In the sterile white of the hospital room, their mother lay pale, and still machines quietly marking the passage of time. Aiko stood at her bedside holding her hand, while Hana placed a fresh drawing on the table, a picture of their mother sitting up, smiling, sunlight spilling over her face. Miles felt something in his chest tighten. This was more than a child's hope. It was almost a vow. On the way back, Aiko spoke for both of them. "We think, if she sees the right picture, she might come back to us." Miles didn't argue, though his rational mind dismissed the idea. Still, he could not ignore the conviction in her voice. Back at the estate, he found himself making small adjustments, clearing a room to serve as an art space for Hannah, ensuring the kitchen was stocked with ingredients Aiko liked to use, rearranging his schedule to be home more often. These were not grand gestures, but they were deliberate, and they signaled something even to himself. He was no longer a passive participant in their lives. However, it was during a late-night phone call that the stakes began to rise. An old acquaintance in the art world mentioned a rumor someone in London was seeking young prodigy artists for a high-profile exhibition, and a man had been making inquiries about talented twin girls in Edinburgh. The description was unmistakable. Miles didn't share this with the twins immediately, but it planted a seed of unease. Whoever this was, they knew enough to start looking, and his home was no longer the unassailable fortress it had once been. Protecting the girls would require more than kindness. It would require vigilance. In the quiet after that call, he walked past the library and saw Hannah asleep in the armchair, her sketchbook open on her lap. On the page was a drawing of the three of them, Hannah, Aiko, and himself, standing together at the gates of the estate, the storm long gone, the sky clear. It was, he realized, not just a scene but a possibility. And in that moment he knew he would do whatever it took to make it real. The confrontation came not with the subtlety of whispers, but with the blunt force of a public accusation. It began when Miles Davenport received a formal letter from a law firm in London declaring that the twin stepfather had secured legal representation to reclaim custody. The letter was dressed in the language of concern and parental rights, but underneath the legal jargon, it was nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to regain control over the girls, and Miles suspected over whatever value someone believed they could extract from their talents. The court hearing was set for 3 weeks later, a compressed timeline that left little room for comfort. Miles had never been a man to shy away from negotiations, but this was no business deal. This was a matter of 2 lives he had come to care for, far more than he had anticipated. He hired Eleanor Reeves, one of Scotland's most respected family lawyers, a woman known for her relentless preparation and ability to dismantle false narratives with precision. However, the legal fight was only one front. The twins had begun to pick up on the tension, and Aiko confronted Miles one evening in the library. "You're going to send us back, aren't you?" She asked, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying the fear she could not hide. Miles crouched so they were at eye level. "No," he said without hesitation. "Not if I have anything to say about it." It was a promise he hadn't yet made aloud, and hearing himself say it crystallized his resolve. In preparation for the hearing, Eleanor urged him to gather character witnesses and any evidence that would demonstrate the girls' welfare under his care. Mrs. Whitaker agreed to testify, as did Dr. Morris, the physician who had examined the girls after the storm and documented their malnourishment and exposure. More unexpectedly, Takeshi, a journalist who had been quietly investigating the stepfather, came forward with a trove of damaging information. He had discovered that the man had been in contact with a notorious art dealer in London, the same one rumored to be searching for child prodigies. It was clear the stepfather's sudden interest in the twins had little to do with paternal affection. The climax came during the exhibition that had been arranged at the city's gallery, a charity event Miles had initially agreed to, so the twins could display their work. It was meant to be a celebration, a way to give them confidence before the looming court date. The room was filled with patrons, the walls adorned with Hannah's most captivating drawings, each one radiating a warmth that seemed to soften even the iciest of guests. However, as Hannah and Aiko stood before their latest piece, a collaborative work that merged Hannah's intricate lines with Aiko's bursts of color, Miles saw the stepfather enter. He was flanked by the London dealer, their expressions a mixture of greed and calculated charm. They approached the girls as if they were long-lost relatives at a reunion, their hands outstretched, their voices syrupy with false affection. Miles stepped forward, placing himself between them and the twins. The conversation was quiet but sharp, each word measured. The dealer spoke of opportunities and future prospects, as though the girls were commodities, not children. The stepfather chimed in about rights and family, his voice dripping with self-justification. Miles countered with the truth that family was not defined by blood alone, but by presence, protection, and love, a truth the stepfather had long since forfeited. The moment of emotional rupture came when Hannah, normally so quiet, spoke up. She held up the drawing they had just finished and said, "We made this for him," nodding toward Miles. "Because he's the one who stayed." The simplicity of her statement cut through the room like a blade. People stopped to listen, and in that silence the stepfather's pretenses collapsed under the weight of his own absence. 2 days later the hearing commenced. The courtroom was austere, the air thick with formality. Eleanor presented the case with unflinching clarity, weaving together testimony, medical reports, and Takeshi's investigative findings. The opposition tried to frame the stepfather as a man struggling to reunite with his family, but the inconsistencies in his story unraveled under cross-examination. The judge, a stern but perceptive woman, listened carefully, her eyes flicking between the documents and the faces before her. When it came time for Miles to speak, he didn't reach for eloquence. Instead, he told the truth plainly about the night of the storm, about the changes he had seen in the girls and in himself, and about the future he envisioned for them, one free from exploitation and fear. He did not plead. He simply offered a vision grounded in the reality of what they had already built together. Finally, the judge rendered her decision temporary custody awarded to Miles, with a clear path toward permanent guardianship pending follow-up assessments. The relief in the room was palpable. Aiko squeezed his hand so tightly it hurt, but he didn't let go. Hannah simply leaned against him, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. Outside the courthouse, the snow had begun to fall again, soft and slow this time. It felt less like a storm and more like a benediction, as though the city itself was offering a quiet blessing on what had just been secured. Yet Miles knew this was not the end. It was the turning point, the moment from which everything else would flow. And as he looked down at the twins, their faces lit with something he hadn't seen before. Security, he understood that no business victory he had ever achieved could compare to this. Spring came slowly to Edinburgh that year, as if reluctant to push away the last traces of winter. The air grew softer. The light lingered longer in the evenings, and for the first time in months the gardens around Miles Davenport's estate began to stir with color. Within the house, life had also shifted into a new rhythm. Aiko and Hannah moved through the rooms not as guests or wards, but as if the space had adjusted itself to them, reshaping its quiet corners into places of laughter, warmth, and creation. The court's decision granting Miles temporary custody had brought relief, but also a sense of responsibility that he felt down to his bones. This was not a matter of holding on for a season. It was a commitment to something enduring. He had never imagined himself as a father figure. His life had been carefully engineered to avoid the vulnerability such bonds demanded, but every day with the twins had begun to dissolve that old design. Their mother's condition remained unchanged, but Miles refused to see this as the end of her story. On Saturday mornings they visited the hospital together. Aiko would bring fresh flowers, Hannah would bring a new drawing, and they would speak to her as though she were simply resting, listening from somewhere far away. One afternoon, Miles brought a framed copy of the collaborative piece the twins had created for the exhibition, placing it on the wall opposite the bed. "So she can see it when she opens her eyes," Hannah explained, her voice steady. It was a gesture so simple and so full of hope that Miles found himself lingering in the doorway afterward, unable to leave until he was certain she had understood, even in her silence. However, life was not only about waiting. Miles began to integrate the girls into more of his world. He took them to the markets in the old town where Aiko delighted in bartering for fresh ingredients, while Hannah collected small trinkets to sketch later. They visited the library at the University of Edinburgh, wandered the galleries of the Scottish National Portrait Museum, and spent afternoons in the park feeding the swans. In these moments, Miles noticed how their guardedness had begun to fade. Aiko's laughter came quicker. Hannah's drawings grew brighter, and both of them started speaking about the future in ways that suggested they finally believed they had one. Still, there were reminders of how fragile this stability was. A letter arrived from the stepfather's solicitor conceding the current arrangement but hinting at a possible appeal. Miles didn't show it to the girls. Instead, he filed it away and redoubled his efforts to create an environment so safe and grounded that any outside threat would feel powerless. Protecting them was no longer a matter of law, it was a matter of love. One crisp morning in early April, Mrs. Whitaker proposed something unexpected, entering the twins into a community art showcase at the local cultural center. "It's not about winning," she told Miles. "It's about letting them share what they've been building here." At first, he hesitated. Public attention had been risky before, but the girls' excitement was immediate and contagious. They worked for weeks, often side by side in the art room Miles had set up for them, Hannah's careful lines merging with Aiko's bold strokes in ways that seemed almost symbolic of the life they were weaving together. The showcase became more than just an event. It was a quiet declaration. Parents and children wandered through the exhibits, pausing at the twins' piece, a sprawling canvas, depicting the estate in spring, its gates open, the gardens alive with blossoms. In the center, three figures stood together, Miles, Aiko, and Hannah, beneath a sky streaked with light. The simplicity of it drew people in, but it was the feeling it carried that made them linger, a sense of belonging, hard-won and deeply cherished. As they stood together in front of their work, Hannah slipped her hand into Miles's. "It's not just a picture," she said. "It's what we have now." Later that month, during one of their hospital visits, something changed. It was small at first, a flicker of movement, a shift in breathing, but enough to draw the nurse's attention. Miles held the girls back gently as the medical staff checked vitals, but his eyes stayed fixed on the bed. The doctor explained that it was too early to predict recovery, but that responses like these were promising. That night, after the twins had gone to bed, Miles sat in his study staring at the Monterey Bay sketch that had started everything. He realized that the gift everyone spoke of wasn't just Hannah's talent or Aiko's energy. It was the way they had drawn him out of his own self-imposed exile, reintroducing him to the messy, unpredictable, profoundly human work of caring for someone else. By the time summer arrived, the estate was transformed. The once quiet halls now echoed with music, conversation, and the occasional thud of a dropped paintbrush. Miles had begun running part of his business from home, rearranging his life so that presence rather than absence defined his days. The final proof of change came during the city's annual festival. The three of them stood together on the Royal Mile, watching the parades pass by, the air filled with the sound of pipes and drums. Aiko pointed out performers she wanted to see next year. Hannah sketched the crowd with quick, sure lines, and Miles found himself imagining that future without the old hesitation. Finally, as the evening light settled over the city, Hannah handed him her sketchbook. On the page was a new drawing, the three of them in the garden, their faces turned toward the sun with the gates of the estate open wide. Beneath it, in small, careful letters, she had written, "Home." Miles closed the book gently, feeling the weight of what they had built together. This wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of a life messy, unpredictable, and immeasurably better than the one he had before. And for the first time in years, he knew he would never trade it for anything. In the end, what began as a night defined by ice and isolation became the start of something far greater than any of them could have imagined. Miles Davenport, once the guarded millionaire who kept the world at arm's length, had found himself transformed by two small figures shivering at his gates. Aiko and Hana, the twins abandoned in a snowstorm, had walked into his life with little more than a threadbare coat, a sketchbook, and an unshakable bond with each other. Over time, they had given him something far rarer than fortune purpose. The battles they faced were real legal threats from a manipulative stepfather, whispers from the outside world, the uncertainty of their mother's condition. But those challenges had only strengthened the ties between them. Miles had stepped into roles he had never planned for: advocate, protector, and, in a quiet way, father. The girls in turn had taught him what it meant to let someone in to replace the cold walls of solitude with the warmth of belonging. Hana's art became more than a talent. It became a language they all spoke. Through each drawing, she showed how she saw the world, not just as it was, but as it could be. Aiko's bright energy breathed life into every corner of the estate, proving that resilience often wears the face of joy. Together, they reshaped Miles's once empty home into a place filled with laughter, creativity, and shared moments. As spring unfolded into summer, their visits to the hospital remained a ritual. Even though their mother's recovery was slow each day, they arrived with something new. A drawing, a story, a bouquet, to remind her and themselves that hope was not a fragile thing, but a steady choice made over and over again. Miles often lingered in those rooms, realizing that these small acts of care were as powerful as any grand gesture. In the quiet moments, he would look back on that first night and marvel at how close he had come to letting them slip away. It would have been easier, safer to send them to someone else's care. But safety without connection, he now understood, was a hollow kind of protection. By choosing to step into their storm, he had discovered a life richer than any ledger could record. The lesson in their story is clear. Sometimes the greatest changes in our lives arrive not through careful planning, but in the form of unexpected interruptions, often messy, inconvenient, and demanding more of us than we think we can give. It is easy to turn away, to say, "This isn't my responsibility." But when we dare to engage to shoulder part of someone else's burden, we often find that we are the ones transformed. In our modern lives, where routines are tight and distractions constant, we may not be faced with snowstorms or abandoned children at our gates. But opportunities to act with courage and compassion still appear in a neighbor who needs help, a friend who has fallen silent, or a stranger whose situation demands empathy over judgment. The challenge is to recognize those moments and choose to lean in rather than look away. Miles's journey reminds us that wealth is not measured solely in money or possessions, but in the relationships we cultivate and the lives we touch. His story is not about rescuing others from the cold, but about how opening the gates literally and figuratively can thaw the coldness within ourselves. So, as you think about their story, ask yourself, where in your own life might you be called to open a door, to offer a hand, to become the person who stays when it would be easier to walk away? Those choices, however small, can change not just someone else's path, but your own. If this story has moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the unexpected ways we can change each other's lives, I invite you to support this journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with someone who might need a reminder of the power of compassion. Your support gives us the motivation to keep bringing you stories that touch the heart and spark the courage to act.